Good morning. The reading today is from Luke chapter 24, verses 1 to 12, the resurrection. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they didn't believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. It's lovely to be with you this morning. Happy New Year. I haven't seen most of you since New Year. It's good to be back. For those of you who are unaware, I spent a little time visiting the Falklands, and I'm back. And you think this weather's bad. That's all I'll say about my experience of the Falkland Islands. So we are looking at the Sabbath at the moment. Last week John spoke. I'm speaking this week, and then next week Hillary's going to be looking at the Sabbath again. And we're looking at the Sabbath from different angles and sort of different theological perspectives of Sabbath and an understanding of it, and how it can shape our lives and how it can impact us, and perhaps trying to get to grips with what the Sabbath is really about, and in particular, does it change? So the question, I suppose, to start with is, what does the Sabbath mean for you? And I suppose for many, it's a throwback from the Old Testament, and perhaps one that no longer stands for the New Testament church of Jesus. And I'm wondering if that's perhaps how you view Sabbath. Something that is what Jews do, but actually it's not really for Christians. You think, well, okay, you may have a point. The problem we have with that argument is that it's one of the 10 Commandments. And so if you're going to do that, you then have to say, well, does the 10 Commandments no longer stand for the Christian church? Or are the 10 Commandments still valid? Are they universal principles, or are they just Jewish principles? Because if they're universal, then they apply still to you and me today. And if you're going to throw away the idea of Sabbath because it's in the 10 Commandments, then which of the others are you going to throw away? Are we going to throw away do not murder? Because that's going to change society slightly. Or do not steal. Again, that will impact the way we live. And so we have to be careful with how we. My computer wants to connect to the internet, and I keep saying no, you don't, and it keeps saying, "You sure?" Positive. So I think it's not quite as simple as, well, it's Jewish, therefore it doesn't apply to us any longer, and so that, because we're the New Testament church, and if we remember, we've not long just finished our study of Galatians, when we were wrestling with this tension that exists between the New Testament church and the Jewish members of the church, and the Jewish members of the church wanting to make the New Testament Gentile church into Jewish tradition and Jewish practice. No, you must obey the Jewish rules. Well, Sabbath was very much a Jewish rule. Interestingly, you never see the Sabbath discussed as part of that in Galatians. You see a lot of the other Jewish traditions discussed, circumcision and some of the other practices around food discussed, but you don't see Sabbath. It certainly doesn't seem to be an issue for Jesus. He seems to obey Sabbath, but with a slightly different lilt. And we'll perhaps look at that. We are clearly looking at an odd passage. You might be listening to what Keith read now and going, "Whoa, that's interesting. That's not what I was expecting on a story about the Sabbath. Why is the story of resurrection on there?" And we'll look at that maybe a little bit later. And always struck when I have the Bible read to me about different things that sort of jump out at me. And it struck me how unsensitive sometimes angels can be. And and I think that's probably the difference between when God deals with people and when angels deal with people. Angels don't sort of suffer fools lightly. So why are you looking for the living among the dead? We think it's a reasonable thing for them to be doing, isn't it? Jesus was very much buried here, and they're treating these women like stupid. Why are you looking for the living amongst the dead? And it seems to be a sort of common theme when the angels engage with people. Whereas Jesus is a little bit more, didn't we speak about this? Remember? That's not how the angels attack it. In the story of Genesis, let's start right back at the beginning. We first hear of the day the Lord rested. If you remember the first chapter of Genesis, the first chapter 1, and then right at the beginning of chapter 2, you have this story of creation. Now, whether you're a creationist or not, and you believe it literally happened in 7 days, or whether you believe it's a metaphor of something completely different, the image doesn't change, and the story doesn't change, and the message is not in any way confused by that. The principle is God takes a rest. That's the principle of this. But I want you to, if you can, try and remember the story from Genesis and see if you notice a difference. So, at the end of day 1, beginning of day 2, what does the Bible say? You're mumbling. There was day and then there was night, the first day. And the end of day 2, what does it say? It says the same thing, yeah. And day 3, it says the same thing. And we go all the way through. Till day 7. Day 7 doesn't have that. Day 7 is the only day without and then there was evening and then there was day. As if somehow day 7 doesn't ever actually end in the Genesis story. That's interesting, isn't it? It's as though somehow that the creation has happened, and yet Sabbath is now in, this day of rest is birthed into creation. It's very much built into the very DNA of creation. And yet God doesn't somehow then say, that's the end of that. We're going into the next day now. It's as though there's a sort of an eternal nature. Now, not that I'm saying that every day is a day of rest. That's not what I'm saying here. But I do think that somehow there's this image right at the beginning of creation that Sabbath has an eternal value, an eternal principle, because it's not actually closed off like every other day of creation is. It has an eternity built into it right at the beginning. So if we were to move into the New Testament church, and in the early church in particular, we find out that as we looked at in the book of Galatians, to start off with, the early church was very much a Jewish sect. It was this sort of radical sect of Judaism. They think, well, actually the Messiah has come. His name was Jesus. He's fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. He is the one that the prophets spoke about throughout the years. He is the Messiah. And it was very much this Jewish sect, and they obeyed the Jewish principles. But very quickly it expanded well beyond the borders of Judaism and into the Gentile world. And then we see the difficulties and the tensions that happened with that in the book of Galatians that we looked at, some of the tensions that were existing between the Jewish sect and the Gentiles, and all got very complicated. You see it in Acts as well. But out of that is birthed this completely different movement. And they start to be known as followers of the way, or Christians, that people who followed this person, Christ, the Messiah, that's what it means in Greek, the anointed one, Jesus. And it becomes a separate movement in it of itself. But to start off with, they very much were still following this day of Sabbath, this Jewish tradition. But also they celebrated the Lord's Day on the Sunday. So it's a win-win. It's almost like a double celebration. And so on the Sunday, they would gather together and celebrate the resurrection, the Lord's Day, the beginning of a new week. And then over the centuries, the Jewish Sabbath in the sort of Christian church slowly dies off. Until in the 4th century, the theologian Eusebius is recorded in saying that Sabbath has now transferred for Christians to the Sunday. So how does this help us to understand our Sabbath? How does it help us with our study of what does it mean for a Christian to have a Sabbath life, to have Sabbath built into our rhythm, our pattern of life? When there's this sort of day of rest that has been moved from the Saturday to the Sunday, and trust me, I know because I've spoken to many of you now, and I've listened to your questionnaires. For many people, especially those who do anything on a Sunday, it's not necessarily regarded particularly as much of a restful day for you. I feel your pain on that one. But I think I do think something significant has happened. And I think partly is because we have to go back to the stories of Jesus as well. We have to look at what the gospel writers are telling us about the life of Jesus. And I think we have to slightly reshape our understanding of Sabbath. And I'm going to be slightly countercultural in that I'm not entirely convinced John Mark's got it right. And I know in this church that's almost verging on heresy. But I'm not entirely sure, because he has a complete Sabbath. It's almost Jewish in his nature. The problem I have with that's not the Sabbath that I see Jesus doing. I see something different with the life of Jesus. He was the fulfillment of all what it was to be Jewish. And yet, he got told off for breaking Sabbath. So we have to be careful with how we interpret the Jewish understanding of Sabbath and what we see the life of Jesus. He did something different. And I think Easter Sunday helps us understand that. So on Easter Sunday, which is why we had this passage read to us, Jesus rises from the dead. And in doing so, he breaks the power of death. His resurrection defeats death. It no longer has the final say in the lives of those who choose to follow Jesus. Death is no longer your final word. There is another word beyond that, and it's resurrection. That is the word that's spoken over you. Eternity at that point is birthed into the lives of humanity. As Christians, we have eternity in our DNA and in our hearts. And if we look forward to John's revelation of what happens in the end times, we have this image of the eternal city. And the eternal city in the book of Revelation is not Rome. It's the New Jerusalem, the eternal city that comes back. Heaven and earth are restored. And this image of creation being restored and God being there, and the relationships are restored, and the sun no longer provides the light because the sun now provides the light. Sickness, death, tears, suffering are no longer in existence. This is our destiny. This is our hope. That should excite us. Obviously not. But when we gather on Sundays and make this our Sabbath, we are reminded of Easter Sunday. That's why we gather. That's why the church moved from Saturdays to Sundays, the holy day, to Sundays, because it's the day of resurrection. So when we gather, we are supposed to focus our hearts, minds, and everything on the resurrection truth, that Jesus is alive. And in being alive, he birthed something into our hearts. He birthed eternity into our hearts. He birthed hope into our hearts. And he brought in his kingdom. His kingdom is a place of work and rest. But what we've done in the church, in the Christian church, we've moved the day off. The Sabbath to the beginning of the week as opposed to the end of the week. So the first day of the week is the Sunday. It's the first day of the week. So that's really interesting because the Jewish rest from work, but Christians work from rest. That's interesting, isn't it? We're supposed to work from a place of rest, from a place of peace, from a place of being so at one with the Father that we can now go out and work for him. Whereas the sort of Jewish picture is we've worked all week, now we need some rest. Christians, it's we've had some rest, now let's go and work. It seems to be a far more positive attitude towards it. And because the kingdom is being birthed into our lives, into our reality. And just as in the Jewish Sabbath, they gather around a meal. And we've spoken about this a reasonable amount now. And if you haven't done so, please, I would love to encourage you. Please go check out some of the Chosen series. We're into series 3 now. Episode 6 just gone live today, I believe, Mark. Tonight, has it? It's an American timing, and I can't quite get my head around it. But it's fantastic, and they look at the Sabbath in that, and they have Sabbath meals in that. And you always see them gathering around a table. And if you know anything about Jewish culture and community, you know that the meal is really, really important in Sabbath community, in Sabbath life for the Jewish people. They gather around a meal and they celebrate the Sabbath. That's no different from the Christian church. We gather around a meal, it just looks different. We gather around a different meal. We gather around a meal that takes us back to a meal that Jesus had with his disciples, where he broke bread in a Jewish fashion. He shared wine and said, remember what I'm about to do. In the Sabbath meal that Jesus births into his community, he points to his death and resurrection. And says this, the new Sabbath is going to be about this. This meal, this Sabbath meal that you will share will be about this. It'll be about death and resurrection. It's about a new hope, not Star Wars, something different. A few people understood that reference. So this is so Sabbath for Christians has been moved to a Sunday, the holy day, where we gather together, we share a meal, and it points us towards this eternity that we have in Jesus. It points us to an eternal kingdom, one where we are resident, one where we will work, but we work from rest. Now, let's go to the life of Jesus. You see, Jesus got in big trouble with Jewish communities for working on Sabbath. But what was his work that he was doing on a Sabbath? He wasn't ploughing fields. He wasn't making benches like his dad taught him to. He was doing the works of God. He was working for God's kingdom, healing people, bringing hope, life, freedom to people's lives. And he got in big trouble for doing so. So I think for Christians, Sabbath is about realizing that we live in the kingdom of God. And our Sabbath is about drawing us back into that reality, drawing us back to gather together, to share in a meal, to remind us, to point us that we are heading towards our eternity with the Father. that we are redeemed by the Son and that we are empowered by the Spirit, and we are called to live in his kingdom. And we gather together to encourage each other to be part of that kingdom. His kingdom where sickness, suffering, death, sorrow is no more. And from that place to go out into the world to take that kingdom into the rest of the week. And that doesn't mean that when we gather here on Sundays that we don't do work, because this is kingdom work. This is kingdom work, gathering together, encouraging each other, listening to his word, worshipping the one, praying to him is kingdom work. And it's supposed to be restful. It's supposed to be restful. And I would say that for Christians, we need to take this concept of Sabbath really seriously. And because I think it, right from the beginning of creation, it was birthed into the DNA of creation. Interestingly, after this, it seems to be that a day of rest every 7 days isn't just a biblical thing. It seems to be a physiological thing, a psychological thing that just seems to be ingrained into our being. You know, strange that when the Bible's been telling us that for a long time, that science has just caught up with that. Following the French Revolution, in an attempt to be entirely secular and to break away from any possible biblical narrative and to become more productive, the French decided that they would go to a 10-day working week. I don't know how that works, whether they just made up a few more days to make did they invent some new names? That's cool. It didn't work. Productivity plummeted. Because strangely enough, the Bible got it right. 7 days is pretty much what we're designed to work on, that cycle of rest. Making it 10 days does not make you more productive, it makes you less productive. Who'd have thought? Maybe God, the creator of all, knows what he's doing. We are supposed to live in rest. And this is not something that I think is easy for us. I think from the Western culture, Western society, it tells us that we have to work and there's so many pressures are put on us. And it's really easy to say, oh, it's okay for you to talk about Sabbath, but I've got this, and this to do. I get it, because I have this, and this to do as well. But it doesn't alter the fact that the Bible seems to say you need to have a Sabbath. God is very repetitive about this. And when he's repetitive about something, he's trying to make a point. You know, he starts off right at the beginning in Genesis with this point. He then says it again in Exodus. He then says it again in Deuteronomy. Jesus lives by it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's fairly repetitive about this concept of Sabbath in the Bible. And it's easy for us to say, oh, but he doesn't understand. You go, really? He's sustaining the whole of the universe, and he doesn't understand what it is to be busy? Are you seriously going to use that argument? I think it's about priority. And look, this is not something we've smashed in our house. So I am not preaching as a converted. I'm preaching for someone who needs to seriously consider and look at how to make this work. But I do think that the image that John Mark portrays is not necessarily the one that is going to fit everyone. I think he takes a really extreme Sabbath. And I think there is something that the life of Jesus teaches us something different if you want to absorb that. And actually gathering on a Sunday is fine. And working for the kingdom is fine because Jesus gets told off for working for the kingdom on his Sabbath. But I do think there's some other things that we need to look at and go, well, can I do that on Saturday? Can I move that to another, or does it have to be done at all? Because actually, I think for the Christian church, our Sabbath rest on a Sunday is reminding us that we are resurrected people. We are people of hope, people of a kingdom of rest and work in balance, a kingdom where God rules and reigns, a kingdom where his values are central and he calls us to uphold them, to live by them, and to represent them to a world that desperately needs to hear them. So I think a different take on a theological understanding of Sabbath is the eternal nature of the kingdom. We are resurrected people. And for us, our Sabbath comes from that place of resurrection, comes from a place of kingdom, and it comes from a place of hope. Just